So it's 7:04. We are going to call this meeting to order. We do have a quorum. We have one more member that may be here a little bit late, but we have a quorum, so we can get started. I'll give him a few minutes to get here. Seth is coming from a previous event. So I'd like to call this meeting to order for the Industrial Development Board, November 23rd, 2021. If you would, please stand and join me with the pledge. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Before we start on our agenda has changed. So we are going to strike number 8 on the agenda, Irish Plastics. The reason why I pushed off retail strategies until December 7th, and I moved that meeting up because we typically meet on the 4th Tuesday, which falls squarely in the middle of the holidays, is we had a very, very full agenda, and then in the last couple of days, it's all pretty much fallen apart. So we won't have as much of an agenda as we previously thought. But on your sheets, we're going to strike number 8, but the rest of the agenda will be set as written. We need to, if you've had a chance to look at your packet, we need to review the minutes from the last meeting, which is July. And if you see any corrections or changes that need to be made, please make note of that now. Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion. Craig Moreland makes a motion to approve. Do I have a second? Ms. Bay makes a second. Any questions, any changes or corrections? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The minutes are passed. Next on our agenda is the finance report. And if you'll see, we actually had a little bit of activity. We had a beginning balance on the 30th of July of $119,531.50. We received funding from the County Commission of Trousdale County in the amount of $10,000, which is specifically earmarked towards the Retail Strategies project. Mr. Thurman had to file a report with the Tennessee Secretary of State, and they charge you $20 for that. And then you'll remember at the last meeting, we approved a $5,000 payment to Irish Plastics, Carson Jones, and you'll see that reflected in this activity. The ending balance is $124,511.50. Thank you, Mr. Thurman, for doing that. One of the things that we wanted to talk about tonight, we need an approval for the finance report.
Make a motion to approve.
Mr. Jewell makes a motion to approve. Do I have a second? Ms. Bay makes a second. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? It passes. Thank you, Mr. Jewell. On number 6 on our docket, on our agenda, the grant program that we had set up about this time last year, or actually mid part of last year, we suspended that at meeting on May 25th. The genesis behind that was when we originally set up that grant process, it was before we were committed and engaged to Retail Strategies project. And our concern was that our fund balance would fall too low if we gave grants out to businesses, although I know they're deserving and need it, but we wanted to try to protect that fund balance as much as possible to fund Retail Strategies contract. That endeavor has reached its 1-year anniversary, and I feel like that engagement with Retail Strategies is extremely hopeful and very likely will yield the biggest return for the community with our limited funds. But upon a lot of discussions with Tennessee Central, Mr. Lyons and Mr. Tidcomb and Mayor Chambers, Tennessee Central handles an account for the Industrial Development Board of Trousdale County that has recurring funds of $20,000 a year. That account is the funds that we recovered the money back from the Anderson Meat Project. If you remember back some months ago, we got the 5,000 and some change back off of what we spent on that endeavor. That's where that money come from, was that fund. That fund right now has roughly $112,000 and some change in it. It's been accruing over the years. It was discussed at length with Mr. Lyons and Mayor Chambers that it's possible that if a business were to come in, an industrial business or a manufacturing business were to come in like Mr. Jones did with Iris Plastics and make a request for assistance, we wanted to help Mr. Jones more than we were really capable of doing. And in the grand scheme of things, $5,000 is not a lot of money when you're putting together a business of that size. So with that, keeping that in mind, we discussed the possibility that if a company like that came in and requested assistance, that the board, the Industrial Development Board, could approve, if it so felt, that grant or that grant contingent on the approval of the board of directors for Tennessee Central that meets quarterly. So what we would have to do is someone would have to make a request. This board would deliberate. If this board chose to grant this request, then this board would authorize the chair to make a formal in writing request to Mayor Chambers. Mayor Chambers, there's a form we fill out, an application. Mayor Chambers, who sits on the board of directors for Tennessee Central, would then present that at the next quarterly meeting. And if Tennessee Central Board of Directors saw that this was a worthy endeavor, they would allow us access to this fund. The reason why we want to go in that direction is that if we approve contingent on the approval through the board of directors of Tennessee Central. That way it doesn't get into our fund balance. And we're just passing, the money is just passing through from Tennessee Central through IDB and then back to the business. It occurs to me that this might be a possibility or an avenue to help these businesses or these applicants with a greater standard than $5,000 if they needed it, or if it would help them more, and we don't deplete our non-recurring funds for retail strategies, which I wholeheartedly feel like is a worthy endeavor. So I would like for the board to discuss this topic and consider reinstatement based on those parameters. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I do. I've got a question for me. Based on this, I would like to see a possibility of a sunset clause where we can come back and reevaluate this. If this is something, you know, that we don't want to leave it open forever, because that relationship may not be open forever. But if we want to go back and reevaluate this on a 12, 24, 36-month basis, because what I'm understanding, this is not coming from our budget. This is coming from grants that we can direct based on Tennessee Central's budget, correct?
Yes, not so much their budget, but the recurring fund that is replenished by TVA, is if I'm speaking correctly. Mayor, can you tell a little more accurately on that?
Yes, Tennessee Central created a grant program. They call it their Economic Development Grant Program that they deposit $20,000 into every year once they receive their TVA in lieu of tax payments. And it's been building up for Trailsdale County. And as Mr. King said, there's 112, a little over 112,000 right there in that fund right now. How Mr. Lyons said this would work is basically the IDB would sponsor this company's application and it would go to Tennessee Central. And as he said, it'd basically be the Tennessee Central would pay it directly to the company. It's just channeling through the Industrial Development Board the application to support it, because one of the requirements for this grant is that the request comes from either the JECDB, if the county has one, or in our case, the Industrial Development Board, since we're Metro.
So keeping that in mind, it is possible to consider, if you wanted to discuss or consider a reevaluation period for the grant program, say every year, 2 years, 5 years, 3 years, or whatever term you feel like that, because we never know what the future will hold. This would be, we can stipulate that we approve this request for funds contingent on the approval through Tennessee Central. If Tennessee Central determines that it is not a worthy request, or for whatever reason they decide not to grant, then we're not necessarily obligated to pay out of our fund balance. Now, the board may choose to, but it's not necessarily obligated. So I think it would be important to make sure that we explain in the beginning for these applicants that you're making an application contingent on the fund being accessed through Tennessee Central at the next Tennessee Central Board of Directors meeting. Now, it's possible that you could add limits. You could add limits to how much money is the cap to put out on each applicant. We get $20,000 a year reoccurring. Some of the caveats to that I would encourage you to consider in your deliberations are, we don't want to burn that account down just because it's recurring. I think it would be senseless to do that, because it is possible and hopeful that one day we might get a big project come across our table. And let's just say, for instance, we get a Facebook approach us, just hypothetically. It's possible that if we had to kick in $40 or $50 or $60,000 into that deal to help bring it to fruition, we would have the funds to help. And it wouldn't necessarily have to rely on the county commission or other areas. We would be able to help get that across the board, which would be a huge thing for our community. So we could put a cap on the applicant's request of whatever you feel is appropriate. It could be $20,000 or no greater, or less, $10,000, whatever you think is correct. You could put a cap on how many applications we take a year. You could put a limit on our minimum fund balance, not to fall below $50,000. And then once it's replenished in the next year. So there's, there's some latitude that you can play with here if you want to draw out some parameters for this particular process. Mr. Jewell.
I think a conscious effort was made a few years back to not access this money for a while, to let it build. Some of the things it's been used for in times past were where we had grants that we had to make a match, and we could use those funds for the match amount, things of that nature. In all my time with Tennessee Central, and I've been to many of their board member meetings, I can't say I've been to all of them, but a lot of them in the last few years, I've never seen any request made by a county turned down. I can't remember any being turned down. Do you, Mayor?
To my knowledge, as long as it fell within the parameters what the economic development grants could be used for, as long as it was an request from either the JECDB or the Industrial Development Board, none I know has ever been turned down.
So I think it's a good likelihood. I'm just saying that to say that if it's a reasonable request and we send it forward to them, they're going to look at it very, very favorably. They typically in times past have looked at the county entity on the board, the mayor, IDB or whoever, to kind of screen it before it ever gets to them. And certainly if they recommend it, it pretty much will happen. I like the idea of reopening the grant proposal. I do think we would need to put a cap on it, either an annual cap or an individual cap per application or both. But certainly those funds are there to be used, and we need to try to use them if we have a need for it. And I think we've demonstrated with the applications we've had and the questions we've had that there is a need for it. But I don't want to deplete it to the point that if we have something that we need a pretty sizable chunk of change, that we have that kind of as a reserve to pull from. I think your reasoning is very, very sound when you said that.
It was just, I really felt like I wanted, or I would like to have seen the board being able to help Mr. Jones more, make a more significant impact on what seems to be a worthy business who is really, really trying hard to tread water. And I don't know, I may be wrong, I may be naive, but it seems like that's our job. Our purpose here is to try to foster and facilitate and help and aid as best we can for manufacturing and industrial jobs, employers and jobs in this community. So it just occurred to me that this might be a way that we could make a slightly more significant impact. And we can't go in there and give them, 6 figures, but if you just say hypothetically, you say that it's a $15,000 or $20,000 cap, that would have made a significant difference to Mr. Jones, I believe. And it helps the community, I think, in the long run. Mr. Graves?
Did I understand correctly that it's $20,000 a year is the max that they will approve in 1 year? Is that correct or not correct?
No, they fund the count $20,000 a year regardless of the grants. And that's why it's over 112,000, because it's been accruing. It hasn't been accessed. So they have not listed any parameters on exactly how much can be granted. It's a case-by-case thing. It's vetted and deliberated by the board. Then it passes through the mayor for his approval and his guidance. And I think the board, if I understand the process, and I've sat in on a few of those meetings now, they pretty much look to him to see, because he's going to be a little closer to the vest with the situation. They're going to look to him and say, what do you, are you in on this? Do you vote for this, or do you support this?
This amount of money is put forward for each of the counties. They each have their separate fund. So it's not like we're competing with the other counties. Sumner, Smith, Macon, they would have their own $20,000 a year that they can access as well. Some let it build, some routinely draw it down almost the minute it hits the bank. So there's no, I don't think, requirement, any time requirement, but it's not something that would be competitive. This money has been set aside for Trousdale County's use and in the ways that you've described.
I can see the idea of a cap. I can see the good in that, but I can also see the shortcoming in that. If we got a very significant opportunity, do you really want to cap yourself? It's kind of a double-edged sword.
I don't think that I personally think a cap is the right thing to do. I kind of think that a minimum fund balance is a better way to go, because in one direction you would say, well, we would have to have a special meeting in order to raise the limit. And in another way, on a cap, and in another way, you would be possibly seen as discriminatory if you chose one business over another in that cap range. So I think I prefer a minimum balance in the fund.
It does beg the question though, and you bring up a valid point, that if we say, for instance, we don't want the balance to draw below 50, let's say I'm using a hypothetical figure, $50,000. And then General Motors comes in and we need that $50,000. How do we get past that? So we need to kind of bear that in mind. Now, I think historically, we just don't have that much industry in this community that's going to come knocking on the door asking for a lot of grant money. But we do have to think ahead for growth and the possibility that if we have 3 or 4 new industries or manufacturing jobs land in this community in the same fiscal year, that they might all come asking for money. So I think it's good to put down some parameters, but we also need to keep in mind the caveat that we do of that parameter so that we can revisit it if we need to. If it's carved in stone and you just can't go below that under any circumstances, then then it kind of defeats the purpose of our ability to help a large business if it needs. I was told that one of the boards in Sumner County had used their grant funds to help pay for permits for Facebook. So that's a thing that we could help a large and incoming business or small businesses and facilitate them settling in this community. So this is something that we need to consider. Now, we do not necessarily have to make a decision on this tonight. This is kind of a big subject. If you guys would like to consider this and push it until the January meeting, wouldn't be a problem. It's a lot to think about, and we need to be smart about it and forward thinking. Mr. Mayor.
There is one part of the grant I forgot to mention, and I apologize. It is an 80-20 grant. So if you had a company that had a $100,000 project, they're going to have to cover 20% of it, or the IDB is going to have to cover 20% of it, because the max that the Tennessee Central grant will do is 80%. So there is a 20% match requirement.
Please explain that a little more.
Well, if they came in, let's say the company came in, wanted to go through this process or this process for this grant, and they had a project that total was $100,000, and they're wanting to use this Tennessee Central grant. Well, Tennessee Central's only give them up to $80,000 because somebody's got to cover that 20%, because that's a match requirement, because Tennessee Central's grant is structured over ECD's grants, and they do 80-20. So either the company or the IDB is going to have to do that other 20. Probably what it would be like the facade grant. Use that down here as an example that's going through the county. There's a 15% match requirement for the property owner. So if they had a project came in, if it was under $3,000, then 15% of that project had to be covered by the property owner. If it went over $3,000, then any amount they had over $3,000 that was met that 15%, then that was the match. So basically, if they had $100,000 project, at the end of the day, either the company or IDB is going to have to pay 20% of that $100,000.
That being the case, let's say, for instance, hypothetically, a company comes in, they ask for $10,000. We deliberate, we approve, we make application to you. Does that mean that they're going to get $8,000 and the IDB is obligated for the other 2, or the company? How does that work?
Well, first of all, it doesn't go through me. It goes from the IDB up to Tennessee Central. I mean, I'd give my input on it, but as far as the process between Tennessee Central and IDB, it doesn't go through me. But it'd be like whatever 20% of the total amount of the project has to be covered by the IDB or the company.
It's an opportunity for us to turn our $20,000 into $100,000 for their benefit. That's the way I would look at it.
That's assuming that the fund has the balance to cover it. Am I correct? Okay.
Okay, $10,000, our $1,000, our $2,000 would turn into 10. If you like those figures better.
That's a standard process with grants. There's a lot of times I'll have a federal grant and a state grant, And then the city has to do match money for my work. So we had a $1.8 million project, and we had 75 was federal, and then we had 10% the state bought in as well. But a lot of times they will have, it's customary that you buy in who is the recipient. I think that stands, it makes them be accountable for what they're asking for as well. It makes them have some buy-in on the process as well. We could, just since we're in discussion on this, we could say we would match. I mean, that's part of what we could do in the creation, if you're interested in opening this up, where if it's an 80-20, that they do 80 and then we do 5%. And then that way the recipient would be accountable for 15%, because we do not have recurring funds. And if we go in and put, what if they come in and they ask for the $80,000? That's a big chunk out of ours if we go more than 5%. That's just a theory. And we don't have to, the IDB doesn't have to match at all. We can just be, I'll call, for lack of a better word, a sponsor, to sponsor the application to go through to them, if I'm interpreting this correctly.
Mayor?
I was gonna say that's correct. You could require that the company pays that 20%, but as Mr. Jewell said, if they had $100,000 project and they only put in 20%, $20,000, they just got a $100,000 project for $20,000. So that, and personally, that's what I would like to see. That way, to me, that guarantees if a company comes to you and asks for this money, that they feel pretty good about the investment they're gonna put into it is gonna be worth it. So that's how I personally would like to see that whatever that 20% match is, that company is going to pay it, because then that's their buy-in, that's their skin in the game to make sure that they brought a good project to you.
We have a sunset on it. Then if we don't like the way it's formatted, we can reformat it when we come back at the next sunset.
I think what we may consider doing, since there's a lot of different avenues and parameters that we could explore in this. If the board chooses, you can make a motion and we can push this off until January, until everybody's had a chance to make some notes, and we could discuss this further, or would you like to go farther tonight? What's the will of the body? Anyone? Mr. Graves.
Honestly, I don't know if my opinion would be any different a month from now. I say if everybody else feels the same, we open it back up and just know that we've got to adopt the rules to go along with it before we, take any action or, help any business with a grant. We'll have to figure that out first, but I think we should go ahead and open it up if we've got a revenue stream that doesn't cost us anything.
This question is for Mr. Jewell and the mayor. Wouldn't you think it'd be more of a wise move to hammer those parameters out before we reinstate the process?
I don't know what parameters we need to put on it. I think the merit of each application, even if it's an application for an $80,000 or $200,000, whatever they're asking for, doesn't mean that we necessarily have to award that. We could offer a portion of it if we saw fit.
Take it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I really think that's almost what we're going to have to do. And in some of the hypothetical bigger deals that we've talked about, certainly if those bigger deals come along, we have opportunities to approach the county commission or the state or explore other funding sources if it's that worthy a situation. I'd like to see us, continue with this grant program. We worked hard putting it together. We know there's a need for it, and there seems to be funds available for it. So I agree with Scott. I don't know. I see the pros and cons of a cap. I really do. And I think we're almost going to need to try to let each application stand on its own. Now we could tell them that the funds are not limited. you know, you're going to have better odds if you're asking for less than $50,000 than you're going to have if you're asking for more than $50,000 or $20,000 or whatever. But that's about as clear as I can be with my thinking on it. I'm very much in favor of us trying to reinstate this, whether we do it this month or we do it in January. To me, there's not anything much going to be happening in December anyway. The other question I would have, and Mayor, you may be able to answer this, at what point are those $20,000 put in that fund? Is it beginning of July? Is it the beginning of the calendar year? Do we have any idea? Are we like, I guess what I'm asking, are we likely that to increase by 20,000 in January, or is it going to be July or August of next year?
It starts on July 1st, the beginning of the fiscal year. They put
Beginning
it
of
in there
fiscal
that then. They receive their TVA payment in lieu of taxes in November, and then when you come around the next July, beginning of fiscal year, they deposit that 20,000 to each county's economic development grant fund.
So we do know that we're going to have at least $20,000 additional in that fund by the middle of the year in another 7 months.
Ms. Lee?
This may be a question that everybody else knows the answer to, but is our application explicit, or our language around that application explicit about that there will be a match? Have we even talked about that?
No. The request, the application is fairly short. It's not a comprehensive, not a very complicated application that we make. The mayor sent me a copy of it. If the board chooses to deliberate and approve a grant contingent on this, then we would fill out the application. It would pass through the mayor's office and then to Tennessee Central. Now, I'm not saying he has veto power at that point, but it'll pass through his office, I believe. And because I think because it comes from his county, he sponsors it essentially and presents it to the Tennessee Central Board of Directors that they meeting that they have quarterly. So no, I don't think it's that specific. Ms. Bay?
Are we in jeopardy of losing this $100,000 balance?
No, it rolls over. It just sits there until you use it.
This is something that is for all 5 counties that Tennessee Central sponsors. We just haven't used it. Mr. Thurman.
Well, obviously there's a need because we had 2 things on the agenda about it, even though the one's been withdrawn for tonight.
Yeah, they both have fallen off the agenda,
But
but they may reoccur.
well, if they
Reappear.
want other people, there will be others, I'd
Sure.
say. I think we need to keep moving forward with it.
Right.
Even though I think this little wrinkle maybe of the 20% is a little something we have to chew on maybe.
It is possible. I'm sort of famous for this, for overcomplicating things. So it's possible that Mr. Jewell has a better plan to take it on a case-by-case basis and not overcomplicate it with too many parameters, ceilings, or limits. And we depend on the board's good judgment to make good decisions at that time per applicant. And that doesn't box us in if we get a larger, more worthy project than another. So it is something to consider. If the board feels like you'd like to move forward and reinstate this program, then we would certainly entertain a motion to such. Mr. Graves.
I make a motion to reinstate the grant program.
Mr. Graves makes a motion to reinstate the grant program. Do I have a second? Mr. Moreland makes a second. Do we have any discussion, questions, comments? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The grant program is reinstated. Would you care to specify that that's just carried out on a case-by-case basis, or just leave it open?
I honestly think we need to leave this as loose as we possibly can. And just know that this board will make good decisions. And I think every opportunity is going to be completely different from the next. And I think you just have to leave it wide open and deal with it as it comes along. Just my opinion.
I don't disagree. And really, this is a multi-tier vetting process because we deliberate and decide, and then we have to make application, and the board of directors for Tennessee Central has to consider it as well. So it's not necessarily a given, just based on this board. If it were to make an unreasonable request or decision, it's possible that it'd be caught down the line. So, all right. So number 6, and I'm sorry.
The only thing that is spinning around in my head is, let's just say that you had an $80,000 project. You had an $80,000 project, but you asked for 100. I mean, there's games that can be played with that, and I guess we have to be the referees on that, because it wouldn't, if they knew the rules of the grant program, they would know to just ask for, 20% more than they actually need. So I don't know. I guess we have to police that, would be my guess on that.
And just because they ask for that amount doesn't necessarily mean that that's the amount we approve. Mr. Mayor.
I would say, first, I've just pulled it up on Tennessee Central's website, and they do have the eligibility and the rules for the grant program, and it does say grant application must be approved prior to expenses being reimbursed. I believe Tennessee Central has their own grant application that you would just be sponsoring for the company to come in. But I think how that would work is Tennessee Central staff's going to work with you to analyze that application before it's ever submitted to the Tennessee Central board. So I think some of those questions that they would, looking at Charlie and Dan, they're going to want some kind of quote or something on that to show, well, here's what it is. I think they're seriously going to try to avoid the situation you just mentioned about them trying to just to cover their 20%. So I think the Tennessee Central staff will work with the Industrial Development Board to analyze that application before it's ever submitted to the Tennessee Central Board.
Their track record is being flexible, and I think our track record needs to be flexible, or our approach needs to be flexible. And you can never think of all the what ifs. And if we can just rely on our good judgment, I think that's what would wind up in the end being the best.
I will tell you, in my limited experience with Tennessee Central, they have been unbelievably helpful and a very strong advocate for our community, and very helpful in so many ways, with guidance and education and help. I just can't say enough good things about the folks at Tennessee Central and the way they help us. Since number 8 has fallen off of the agenda, we're down to number 9. It is time for our retail strategies invoice for year 2. It is in your packet. I feel like since we're making a large expenditure, it'd be wise to get a vote to approve the payment of that invoice before we send the money out. Mr. Jewell.
Make a motion to approve payment of this invoice.
Mr. Jewell makes a motion to pay the invoice for year 2 of retail strategies. Do I get a second?
Second that.
Ms. Bay makes a second. Are there any questions?
Mr. Chairman.
So if there's no further questions, I'm sorry, Mr. Ray.
You're going to need somebody to make the motion. Mr. Jewell is not a member of the Industrial Development Board.
I
So would
rescind my
somebody like-
motion.
Let's start the motion again. Would somebody like to make a motion? Ms. Bay makes a motion. Mr. Graves seconds. Any questions? All in favor, say aye. Any opposed? So passes. Mr. Thurman, if you would handle that, that would be wonderful. I will tell you that I had a conference call with Retail Strategies the other day, and we've set up a meeting for them to zoom in on December the 7th. I know I'm getting a little ahead on the agenda, so that they can bring us up to date on the first year's progress and their action plan for year 2. So if anybody, if you guys can come to that meeting, I think it would be really educational and helpful for you to be here and see where our investment is going and what they're doing for us. I know that they have helped the mayor with the Wayfinder grant, signs that he's working on the artwork now.
Yes, sir. They helped us with the application for the 3-star. It was a competitive grant. I think there were 35 or 53 given out. It was $47,000, $47,500 is what we received for wayfinding signage. And that was recommended not only in the study they did on downtown revitalization, but also in the 2016 transportation study. So I actually was in contact with them yesterday, and they sent a proposed design for the signs, and we're kind of going back and forth on that. So they have been very helpful on that. And again, that was $47,500, no local match. So that's complete state money.
Very good. Thank you, Mayor, for working on that. I saw some of the art and it was exciting to see. Very colorful and easy to read. The pilot program, just an update on that. There have been 2 focus group meetings held under the direction of Mr. Rochelle and Mr. Benson. And basically these were put together by Mr. Rochelle and Mr. Benson to interview or to discuss, interview is not the right word, but to discuss with different segments of the community that could be impacted or could have input on a pilot program, a payment in lieu of taxes. And they were going through the policies and procedures handbook or policies and procedures guidelines. And Mr. Rochelle and Mr. Benson have worked very diligently to bring that document up to date as legal lingo changes and evolves with the courts. They're bringing it right up to 2022 standards. So it'll keep us probably out of trouble in the future, hopefully. Those meetings have gone well. Those meetings, just roughly, the first meeting, I sat in as a representative of industrial development. Mr. Jewell sat in as a representative of the commission and chairman. We had Mr. Potts in a meeting, tax assessor. We had Mr. Philip Holder from the banking standpoint and was a former member of Industrial Development Board. So in the second group, we had, I think, did Ms. Carmen attend that one? Cindy Carmen, she was invited as trustee.
Cindy Carmen?
Yeah.
Yeah, she attended.
Okay, so we've invited the Mr. Rochelle and Mr. Benson and the mayor have invited key people to these to get positive input on the language, the parameters. Basically we're setting a skeletal framework, and once that is refined, it will go before the commission for approval. And then at that point, the board, the IDB board, may operate within those parameters for any pilot deals that are potentially presented to us. So for instance, they're potentially putting together a cap, a maximum amount of time that would be granted in a pilot program for each particular project. Now, if that cap, and I'm using a hypothetical, is say 7 years, or it may be 5 years, I don't know. But the standard these days is shorter periods. Give them more money up front and make it a shorter period so you can get that full tax revenue in earlier. I believe also I failed to mention Mr. Satterfield, I believe was part of that as well.
He was invited, but he was not able to anticipate that day. He did send one of his staff. However, I've talked to him, and I'm going to work with Mr. Benson and Mr. Rochelle to get a date where we can sit down directly with Dr. Satterfield and cover this project and answer any questions he has and get his feedback.
And the reason why we're talking about Mr. Satterfield is, roughly 60% of property taxes go to the schools. So property taxes, a payment in lieu of taxes program would have a significant impact, mostly positive for Mr. Satterfield, but he needs to have his input and have his views heard on that subject. And I think that's the goal of Mr. Benson and Mr. Rochelle, is to make sure that everybody that is potentially affected or has is in a unique position to give some insight or opinion on this project and these policies, has an opportunity to be involved and participate. Mr. Rochelle, in his vast experience, knows that having community buy-in to these projects is paramount to its success. So he is guiding us through this with a lot of excellence, and we're excited about it. So we've had 2 focus group meetings. I think they are discussing a potential third, but I think that sometime early in the first part of this coming year, we should have that document most of the way ironed out. So we are moving forward. It's a little bit slow, and with the holidays, it's going to be delayed, but we are moving forward. And forgive me, I jumped the agenda. I'm struggling to stay focused. We're now down to the point, is there any other business or public comments? Does anybody have anything they want to bring up or discuss that we haven't addressed on the agenda? Ms. Leah?
We need to revisit item 5 on the agenda and make our motion and our second legal.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Mr. Jewell was the motion
Okay.
on number 5.
I was going to bring that up. I apologize. I'm in so many meetings and a part of this so long that I forgot that I wasn't an official member. I apologize.
No apology necessary. Your guidance and participation with this board is very valuable. So we just see you as part of the family. Thank you, Ms. Leah, for bringing that up. Let's do it correctly. We need a motion to approve the financial report, the treasurer's report.
Make the motion.
Ms. Bay makes a motion. Get a second. Mr. Moreland makes a second. Are there any questions? Discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. Thank you, Ms. Leah, for keeping us straight. I believe this concludes. If we have no public comments or anybody that has anything they want to ask or discuss, Mayor, do you have any other business that we failed to cover?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, we had a shorter meeting than we planned. Please make every opportunity to be here Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, December the 7th. If for some reason you are traveling for the holidays or you cannot be here, we can set you up on a Zoom meeting so you can at least dial in and participate and hear the presentation. It's 2 separate teams. The team of Elliot and Jen that ran the first year is handing off the ball to the second team, which is Harris and John, I think. And Harris, female, I got confused with that too. Harris is going to be heading this up with John Ruzick, I think is his name, Ruzick or Ruzick. He'll have to correct me on the pronunciation, but they are going to be handing off. So we're going to hear from Elliot and Jen on their first year's progress and what they've done for us in the first year. And then we're going to hear the action plan for second year. I will tell you that I pushed on them pretty hard the other day in the phone call. So hopefully we'll see even more activity, but I still feel very confident this is a wise endeavor. So with that being said, I'll take a motion. Oh, Mr. Jewell.
We have on the county calendar that from 6 to 7 o'clock. Do you feel like that's going to require a 2-hour time period?
It should be at 7.
Do you think we can cover it in 1 hour?
I think so.
What's on there now is 6 to 7. I just want to clarify so we can make sure that the county calendar reflects the right hours.
Unless I misunderstood the email I got from Miss Amy, I thought it was 7 o'clock.
Unless I'm looking at it wrong. I may be. I'm old and feeble.
But to answer your question, yes, I think an hour is plenty.
Okay.
We're basically calling that meeting as an early December meeting, just basic. That'll pretty much be the only thing on the agenda.
I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong committee. It's 7 to 8. That's
7.
correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
So I think 1 hour will be sufficient. I don't think they're going to have that much information.
Just was going to try to get that changed if we need to.
I'll entertain a motion. Mr. Graves, ready to go. Motion to adjourn. Do I get a second? Ms. Bay is a second. We are adjourned. Thank you.